Good morning, everybody. My name is Wendy Lathrop. I am a land surveyor, a land use planner, and also a floodplain manager. With all of the problems with flooding, as you heard just in this last presentation, if you were here for the Eastwick session, I thought that it was important to talk about what buyouts are and how they actually occur and why we do them. I've been getting a lot of questions about them lately. I do a lot of work in New Jersey since I lived there for 30-something years, and I work with, I'm a self-employed solo practitioner. My company is Cadastral Consulting, but some of the work that I do is for the state of New Jersey for their open space program, which also has a subset that works with some of the floodplain management and the buyout program. So we're going to be talking about many aspects, and if you've got questions, I'll try to address all of them as well as I can. I'm not an engineer, so I can't get into some of the answers about how they figure out certain water heights and things like that, but I'll do the best that I can to address your answers, or I can send you to somebody who does know the answer, which is always just as good. So I thought I'd start with this quote from Governor Cuomo from New York right after Sandy hit. It was a long quotation about why he was wanting to have a very large program for buyouts after Sandy wiped out a huge area along Long Island and actually even down into the 5 boroughs that make up New York City. New York City was underwater, unlike anything that had ever been seen before. Sandy was a very unusual storm in that usually hurricanes run from south to north, nor'easters come the other direction, but this storm came perpendicular to the coast. So it brought a lot of water in from the ocean. The other thing you need to know is that hurricanes go in a counterclockwise direction. So as it's coming in counterclockwise, perpendicular to the shoreline from the ocean, it is bringing mass quantities of water with it. So it was at a different direction from what was usual. It was during a high tide, and it was during a full moon, which means you had a higher high tide. Very, very unusual circumstances. However, it's a warning that nature is unpredictable, and sometimes nature's going to do what nature's going to do. So we'll start on with a little bit about what water does. We usually think of the impacts of flooding, just inundation, water on a location where you wouldn't normally expect to have it, or where you don't necessarily want it. Anything that has, any situation where there's water in a location where you don't want it, we call it flooding. When we are talking about the National Flood Insurance Program, we are talking about a specific probability of flooding, and that is what used to be referred to as the 100-year flood event, but is more appropriately termed the 1% annual chance flood event. The opportunity for there to be a certain amount of water each and every year, 1% of the time. Now that's not to say you couldn't have that same amount of water every single year. Each year you have that same probability. And it's not to say that you couldn't have more than one such event in any given year as well. So when we're talking about the flood program and some of the aspects that I'll be addressing later on, think about this 1% chance event. Now, besides the inundation, there are other things that happen. Things float in the water and they strike buildings and they strike bridges, and that's called debris impact. It causes structural damage. It's a real problem. And you can't necessarily get back into your building unless you've had them investigated to make sure that it's still structurally sound. Also the fact that we have saturation, both of the structure itself, so that the materials in it may no longer be stable. For instance, if you've got plaster or plasterboard in your building, if that becomes saturated, it's all going to crumble and fall out. Sometimes the mortar between stones and bricks can be dissipated from the saturation just becoming too soft, but also soils. When soils become saturated, they're no longer stable, and you'll find that buildings start to sink and shift and float away. As I mentioned, structural damage, partly from debris impact, but partly also from the saturation and the sinking and the shifting and the buildings are no longer in one piece. They're having a kind of a ripple effect underneath them. Also, we have erosion. When we have soils that are so saturated they cannot stay in place anymore, they wash away. And I'll have a photo that will show you one of the problems that occurs with that. And of course, there's loss of life and loss of property. All right, so these are some of the things we need to keep in our minds when we're talking about flooding and why we need to get our structures, our homes, and our businesses out of floodplains, particularly the 1% floodplain. So this is in Philadelphia. This is on an island called Venice Island. This was right after Hurricane Floyd, and it's showing that even tractor trailers can be moved by water. We need to remember that it only takes 12 inches of water, 12 to 18 inches of moving water to move a car. And we're not talking a big vehicle like this. We're talking about your family car. You should not walk through moving water that's more than 4 to 6 inches deep because it will sweep an adult off his or her feet. Moving water is very dangerous. So that's part of the reason we have this debris impact, things moving where we don't expect them. Also, you can see by the color of the water, there's a lot of material that's either riled up by the moving water or washed off from surface, whether it be industrial waste, whether it be oil slicks on a parking lot, all of those kinds of things, they all end up in the water, so we have health hazards to deal with. This is a situation where we had saturation, and while the building itself was partly disrupted from its foundation from rising waters, the fact was that the trees, the soil under the trees was so saturated they couldn't stand up anymore and they fell on the building. We need to remember that when we're planning our developments, that roadways, when they're inundated like this, means that you have to plan your evacuation routes. It means you have to plan where your critical facilities are, such as hospitals and police stations and electrical transformer buildings and things like that, so that you can actually get in and out of them. And then this is an image of what happens when you have erosion, and this is very common still out on Long Beach Island in New Jersey. Big swaths of the soil were washed away. All the formerly subsurface utilities are now on the surface of the ground. And so that is a real danger. Okay, so I guess I don't have sticky fingers. This isn't working all that well. There we go. All right, so we have many, many costs of floods. Obviously, to property owners who will be losing their homes or the contents that are in their homes, to businesses when they have to close because of flooding, people can't get to work, or the building itself is inundated and all of the, goods that are in a building may be damaged. So they're, either business is interrupted or it may go out of business if the area is inundated too long and critical facilities are not restored, electricity, water, and things like that. That's the main reason that parts of Long Island or Long Beach Island are not coming back right yet, is because the utilities are not able to service yet. They're still disrupted. And then of course to communities as well, because communities will be losing their tax rateables and also the costs for search and rescue and emergency response kinds of things. So the big question people have is, well, okay, so I've got damage, but doesn't insurance cover, making me whole again? And the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. First thing we have to remember is that your homeowner's policy is not the same as a flood policy. You have to have separate flood insurance to be covered for a flooding event. And then when you have a flood policy, there are two different kinds: contents and structure. Then there are other circumstances as well. Okay, so if you have a flood insurance policy through the National Flood Insurance Program, then there is a clause in there. It's called the increased cost of compliance. Because if your building is damaged more than a certain amount due to flooding, then you need to build your building back to current codes and ordinances, and not the codes and ordinances that were in effect at the time the building was originally erected. That increased cost is only partly covered by insurance. That's up to $30,000. Then there's also this aspect of properties that are repeatedly damaged by flooding. And structures that are subject to severe repetitive losses, there is a limit on how much they can be covered before they're no longer eligible for this national flood insurance. All right, so here's an example of an exception. This is set by the federal laws that establishes the National Flood Insurance Program. Basically, if you have 4 claims that are $5,000 or more within a 10-year time frame, or if you have 2 claims that total more than the full fair market value of the structure, meaning the market value before it was damaged, it's pre-storm, within the past 10 years. So there's a limit, and once you have hit that limit, you are no longer eligible for the federal policy, and you have to buy private policy, which is significantly more expensive. So a little bit of background about the National Flood Insurance Program, which I always feel is very important. We have to look at the whole picture and not just this one piece, because otherwise it's hard for us to figure out why is this part not working the way that I expected. You need to see the whole picture. The first thing is that the flood program, which was created in 1968 and then really updated in 1973 to include structural approaches to sounder construction in floodplains, there are 3 main parts. First, we have to know where the possible harm is going to be. We have to map and identify those flood risks, those 1% annual chance flood risk areas, also other areas that are of lesser risk, but also important to know. This establishes a framework for sound floodplain regulation, which there are minimum criterion set by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA. Those are in the Code of Federal Regulations, and those serve as the minimum standards that all the local communities that belong to the National Flood Insurance Program, so that their residents can purchase national flood insurance, they must adopt those as a minimum. They can always be more stringent, but they can't be less stringent. Now, they use the maps to know where they need to be regulating and how to regulate, how stringently to regulate. And then, of course, the part about making this flood insurance available through, by communities enforcing this sound floodplain management kind of approach.
Does the thing have to say you can't build in the floodplain?
Only in certain areas. Only in certain areas. Okay. And those, there's nothing that says you absolutely cannot, but there is much more stringency in certain areas called floodways. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to go into, the hydrologic and hydraulics of the floodplain, but there are certain areas where it's more difficult, but it depends. If you meet certain technical criterion, you can build just about anywhere, but certain kinds of things you can't build in particular areas where it's a very high risk, even higher risk than this 1% chance floodplain. Okay, so this is actually on Long Beach Island, right after Sandy, and as you see, there's a lot of debris on the houses that were just kind of ripped apart. Okay, so the flood insurance program was established by Congress, and it was noticed that the first word is to reduce exposure to hazards, not to eliminate it, but to reduce it, because we know that people are always going to live and work near water. We need water. All the first settlement of humans in any new area is near water for drinking, for bathing, for agriculture, for navigation and commerce. We have always been near water, but the whole idea is to do it as wisely as possible. If we can't avoid it, is there some way that we can kind of minimize our risks? Okay, so part of that reduction of risk is through this idea of floodplain management. It's not flood control, it's floodplain management. And this comes out of FEMA's website. They have a whole list of definitions. It's a decision-making process for wise use of floodplains, meaning reduced flood losses, plus also remembering that the world isn't all about human beings, that there are, there's flora and fauna that we need to pay attention to as well. And that the floodplains themselves serve very valuable purposes, just the same as wetlands in terms of reducing flood hazards in other areas. They take the first brunt of a storm. Okay, so there are various approaches to floodplain management. One is the non-structural, which means let's control human behavior. Let's not build in certain areas, or if we're going to build in certain areas, we're going to make sure that the building is high enough off the ground so that water can flow underneath of it. Health ordinances, land use ordinances, subdivision ordinances, that's non-structural. Structural is, okay, we're going to build a big ditch or a culvert and we're going to direct all the water into it. So those are two of the approaches, but there's also, didn't have to do it double. There we go. Then there's also this idea of mitigation, which is, first of all, let's try to avoid it. But if we can't avoid it, how can we make it a smaller impact, both to those who are going to be living or working in an area, and we need to think about the cumulative effects of construction in floodplains. Okay, so that's what all of this is about. And then again, remembering that it's not all just about humans, that we need to think about the environment as a whole. It's much more holistic. Okay. So a variety of different approaches. The first one is to flood-proof structures. And by flood-proofing, we mean making them resistant. Again, it's not making them completely watertight. There are two different approaches to flood-proofing. There's something called dry flood-proofing, where you try to seal structures. And then there is wet flood-proofing, where you actually let the water into the building. You say, wet flood-proofing, that sounds like an oxymoron, but the thing is, it is to reduce the amount of water pressure on the face of the building, equalize the water. If the water comes in, then the building won't implode from the weight of the water. Water weighs a lot. It was, what, 62.5 pounds per cubic foot, right? So think about 3 feet of water all the way around the building, pushing in. Two things can happen. Either the building can implode, or if there's enough air in it and the soils are saturated, the building can be uplifted from its foundations and washed away. So the whole buoyancy factor. So we have those two main approaches, wet floodproofing and dry floodproofing. Then we have the ability, the option of elevating structures so that the lowest floor is at or above the expected height of the flood level, which we call the base flood elevation is the term we use for the expected height of that 1% annual chance flood event, that base flood elevation. Federal minimum requires that the lowest floor of buildings, including the basement, any new construction has to be at or above that base flood elevation. Communities can always be more stringent, and they can add what they call freeboard, which is an extra safety factor, and make it a foot above. Yes, ma'am?
Does that include crawl spaces? Only living space?
If it's not living space, if you're talking about a crawl space that, is just like an air pocket, no, because there's nothing in there. Yeah. Okay. I do a whole thing on, crawl spaces and basements and structure, but that's not this, guys. But that's a good question, because your building has to be on the ground somehow. But basically, the best way to do it is make sure you have breakaway walls so that there's less obstruction. Okay, then we have the idea of taking a building and physically moving it from one place to another. This is possible, it's very expensive, but you can do it. I've seen this done with historical buildings, and it's fascinating. It's a way to save structures. But then there's the last one here, which is what we're going to talk about this morning, which is to remove and demolish these buildings. For the most part, there's some structural damage anyway, and they're called buyouts. They're also called acquisitions because buyout has kind of a bad connotation to some people. Okay, so to accomplish some of these different approaches to mitigation, we have these things called hazard mitigation grants, that are available from various government entities. They're available from FEMA at the federal level and through PEMA, the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency here in our state as well. So all of these are part of hazard mitigation. We have federal disaster assistance, That means after there's a presidentially declared disaster, there is some money that's available for hazard mitigation, which can include elevating structures, moving structures, and removing structures. In Pennsylvania, it's our state emergency management agency that administers the program. When we have these things such as buyouts, it's usually 75% provided by the federal government and 25% matched by the local government. In other words, you have to put something up. There are some exceptions when a local community just is unable to make that match. Sometimes there can be an in-kind, services kind of a match, and other funds may be available, but FEMA does not put out more than 75%. So basically, the whole thing is, again, reducing our vulnerability. Yes, ma'am.
So I take it this is a more expensive scenario than FEMA would pay if you would settle for if you had like 45% of your structure.
No, that's the amount. Okay, for a buyout, we'll get to that. I will address that because
Okay.
I think you have a misconception about it.
I'm trying to
Yeah.
see the economics of it.
Okay.
But it sounds like you're talking about public building. I mean, what about the individual guy who wants? Does he have to put 25% or is
No. Individuals are bought out, and we're almost there. Okay. So the application is not by individuals. Yes, sir.
Could you clarify on the last part, that 75% is the federal money?
Yes.
The 25%, is that state money or local community money?
The local community is responsible for it, but it can raise it in various ways. It may be able to get some of that from there may be some state monies available as well. Okay, so you'll see on this list that it is not the individual homeowner who makes the application. That it is through these government entities. So rather than dealing with 1,000 different little individuals, the program prefers to deal with it as a group. So it is by government entity, okay, that will make the application. So when we're dealing with hazard mitigation grants, they cover many different things. The one that we're most interested in is this first one here, which is the acquisition side of it. Acquisition or relocation. All of these other things are also available, and communities are supposed to have and must have, before they're eligible for these funds from the federal government, they must have in place their own hazard mitigation plan, how they are planning to develop soundly or redevelop soundly, or their land use. That is all necessary before they are eligible for any of this grant money. Okay, so when we're talking about hazard mitigation in the form of buyouts or acquisitions, this is somebody on Long Island. Basically, the water came through and ripped out everything. This is what a flood looks like. Okay. Basically, it is permanent. Once the property is purchased by this program, through this program, with funds from this particular program, that land must be kept open and undeveloped forever. There's a clause in the deed as the property is sold by the individual homeowner that says this land will never be developed again, with certain exceptions, and I'll get to that. It is voluntary. There is no condemnation, because that's often a big concern. Well, my neighbor on each side is selling, but I don't want to sell. I've lived in this house my whole life. My grandparents lived in this house. I don't want to go. That person does not have to sell. The land all the way around can be sold, but it's a matter of doing a lot of community outreach and education about what happens if you have a lot of repetitive flooding on your property. The fact that that individual who doesn't want to be bought out is going to have increases, dramatic increases in flood insurance costs, particularly with the passage of the new law this last July of 2012. Biggert Waters Act finally took into account that everybody should be paying the same flood premiums if you're at a similar kind of a risk. Before, it was set that if your property was built before a certain date or before the area was identified by the maps as being flood prone, you paid a lesser amount, even though your house still flooded, as opposed to those who built after the maps were issued and you therefore should have known. That is all being changed and everybody's going to be paying the same amount. Furthermore, so that's one part of it. This holdout person has to be aware of the insurance is going to keep going up. Furthermore, as you have more claims, just like, you know, if you have car insurance and you keep hitting telephone poles, your premiums go up and eventually you're not eligible for insurance anymore. Same thing with the flood insurance. It will go up, and then when you hit those amounts that I mentioned earlier for severe repetitive losses, you're no longer eligible for federal insurance and you have to get private policy. We usually talk about Lloyd's of London as though, you know, that's the cream of the crop, but basically that's it. That kind of a policy costs much more. And when this voluntary buyout is made, it is at the fair market value. So it is, you know, they're not going to, it's not like at the highest point of the market, but it is not a bargain basement amount either. So it allows people to get a new start in a place where they're not going to have the same kinds of problems. So a short list of why we're looking at these. First of all, as I mentioned, if your structure is damaged more than a certain amount, so it has always been if your building is damaged 50% or more of the fair market value, then when you rebuild, you have to bring the entire structure back up to current code. Not just the portion that you're rebuilding, the entire structure you bring up to current code. There's also a change from this law that was passed last year. It used to be 50% of any improvements. If you added, made a huge improvement to your house and it added 50% more of the value, then you had to bring the whole structure up. That has been reduced to 30%. So it's, it's a lower trigger and you have to comply more quickly with bringing your entire building up to current code. So there's a big cost if you don't comply with the regulations. I already mentioned severe repetitive losses, and then there's this thing called the community rating system, which is a program, it's a voluntary program for communities to be proactive in their floodplain management. And if they do certain things that are proactive to kind of minimize and reduce risks within their floodplains and throughout their communities, then they gain points. And when they get certain number of points, then they're everybody within that jurisdiction is now eligible for a reduction in their flood insurance rates. And they're done in like 5% increments. There are some communities where they've gained so many points, they're up to like 50% reduction in their flood premium. So it's very valuable. And one of the things that is a big selling point to communities for acquisitions is that when they remove structures from flood-prone areas, that gains them points as well. So that's another reason that you might want to invest in buyouts.
Could you go back to the, because you mentioned before also that you had to have a plan in place before.
Yes, you have to have a hazard mitigation plan, right. You are required as a member, as a community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. There are a couple of things you have to do. One of them is that you have to adopt ordinances that will either meet or exceed the minimum standards that are established in Title 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Another part of it is that you have to have a hazard mitigation plan. Part of that is about planning where planning where buildings and construction and your infrastructure will be. Part of that is about emergency response, evacuation routes. How will you notify people when they need to evacuate? How will you notify them when it's time to come back? Lots of different aspects of it, but that's a requirement before you belong to the program as well. Does that address your, okay. I can talk more about that later off the side here. Okay, so what buildings are eligible for this? Again, this is on Long Beach Island. I don't think they're going to cut it in half here. Basically, any building that is in this 1% annual chance floodplain. It is not available for the most part. There may be some exceptions, I've not been aware of any, outside of the mapped areas. So if you're looking at your community's flood insurance rate map, then it is the area that is the dark gray. There are three colors. There's white, light gray, and dark gray. Anything that's in the dark gray is eligible for it because those areas are in what we call the special flood hazard area, the 1% chance floodplain, and those are the areas at most risk. So any of those, if you have a property that's subject to those severe repetitive losses, those are given higher priority because those are obviously just going to keep getting beaten up by, by the water. And then again, as I mentioned, these hazard mitigation plans, the whole idea of what is the community going to do to deal with floodplains and flood hazards, including an aspect of buyouts in there is critical because in the process of filling out your application, it has to say, okay, now we're supporting this point within our hazard mitigation plan. That gives you a little bit more viability. Okay, so there are various steps to it. The first part is that first the local landowners have to want to be bought out, and they will approach the local community, but the community is the one that will make the application. And there's a lot of paperwork involved with this, a lot of paperwork. Here in Pennsylvania, all the applications are available on FEMA's website through our Department of Environmental Protection. There's a whole section for Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, and that's where you'll find all of the application forms, many, many different forms. And they are also very helpful when it comes to walking you through some of the processes. Okay, so the community has to fill out this paperwork, some of which I'll go through in a few later slides here. The state will then review it and help, which they need to kind of prioritize what the properties proposed for buyouts. They set priorities for that. And they also check to make sure that all the paperwork is in order and that the hazard mitigation plan of the community is in order and that all the pieces kind of fit together. Then it will send it on to FEMA, which is where we're going to get the funding, the major part of the funding. And FEMA will review it for various approaches. One is, environmental soundness. Are we returning lands to open space? Is it cost effective? In other words, the amount of money we're putting into the buyout, is that going to save us X number of dollars as opposed to what it costs us to go out in our boats and rescue people from their rooftops and putting people up in school gyms and things like that. Lots of different aspects of that. Then it will also review what the actual acquisition process is. They're overseeing the step-by-step process as well. And then they will make sure that the land is cleared. They are reviewing each of those. They basically have a checklist before the funds are released. So the application itself. The basic buyout, first it's going to have information about each individual property. And that will include what is, there's a lot of information in here. We'll go in a little more damage about what that is. What kind of a structure, square footage of it, whether it's above or below the expected height of the flood, that base flood elevation, where it's situated in relationship to the nearest water body that is the source of the flooding. Lots of different information about that. The budget for this acquisition, which includes more than just the purchase of the site, of the structure, but also clearing of the site and management of the site as an open space afterwards. That's all part of the project, okay? And then supporting information, photographs of the buildings themselves, maps that show where all of the proposed buyouts are so you can see if they are contiguous or they're scattered all over the place. Does it make sense that you're going to have, okay, now you're going to have a block with 3 houses left on it and everything else is bought out, or is it the whole block that's cleared out? It will help with some of the prioritization in there. And then again, some of the information from the hazard plan from the local community. Included in this is,
12 minutes.
what's that?
12 minutes.
We'll get there. Okay. So included in this is what we call benefit cost analysis. And as I mentioned, is it going to save us more money than what it is going to cost to do the buyouts? And this is a big part of the paperwork that the community needs to fill out. Basically, it has to at least break even for it to be considered. Okay. This is just an example of it. And this is one where it came out. More than that, it's 1.5 times what the actual cost is. So therefore, in terms of what your reduced future costs will be, which includes things like rescuing people as well. Okay, so for the individual homeowner, first the property needs to be appraised because you need to see what the value pre-storm actually was, the square footage, what the uses of the various rooms were, how high it was elevated above the flood elevation, all of that. There's negotiation between the owner and the community. It's not, as I said, it is not condemnation. It has to be completely voluntary. Then there's a closing, as there is with any time there's a transfer of real property interests. The community then has to hire somebody, which is part of the project cost, to come through, demolish the structure, remove all the debris, take it off site, and then refurbish the site so that you don't have a bunch of ruts and things like that, so that it's actually going to be suitable open space, parkland. And then it has to be permanently designated there. So the cost breakout. The community will pay for part of it, but the homeowner must also pay for part of it. The community will pay for an appraisal for the value. The community will pay for the title search. Now, a title search is where you go through all of the papers that say what kind of interest that the homeowner had. Was it good? Was it clear? Are there liens against the property that have to be satisfied? Is there a question about if this person really owned it, or whether there's another family member or things like that? So community pays that. There's a survey because there has to be what we call an elevation certificate, a form that is a topographic measurement of the elevations on site. The ground elevation, the basement elevation, the lowest floor elevation, all of this is reported on this form called an elevation certificate, along with photographs to show the building. And then the closing costs, all that's paid by the community, whereas the property owner must make sure that all of the other liens against the structure are actually satisfied. Mortgages and liens, and then you pay for your own moving costs. Okay. So if you have other income as a result of the disaster, let's say you have certain disaster assistance, that's going to come out of some of this this buyout money. So it's kind of tricky balancing that. Just because you have an assessment for an appraisal for fair market value, that may not end up being what you get at the closing table if you had certain grants that were meant to make you whole. There are a few exceptions. For instance, let's say you were rebuilding after hurricanes Irene and Lee, and you're partway through the project and you had a hazard mitigation grant to do that, to retrofit your structure, and then Sandy comes along. In that instance, that first grant was unrelated to the second one, and so that's not counted against. But if you had applied for hazard mitigation based on Sandy and now you're getting a buyout based on Sandy, then it's balanced against it. So FEMA has a very big role in this, and that is to make sure that everything runs on time and is going to come in under budget. They do inspections on site. They make sure that everything is technically going the way that it should, and also making sure that the money is being granted, given to the contractors on time as well, because we don't want any of that kind of argument to hold up the whole closing. There are quarterly site visits or conference calls, but even after the closing and the clearing of the site, there are visits by FEMA several years at a time. I believe it's a 5-year revisit to make sure that the project is still being kept up the way that it was intended to. And part of this is based upon, I'll get to that one, okay. So here's what that's the state's role, and here's the community's role, making sure that all the bills are paid, making sure that it has found a way to match the fund, that's 25% matching on there, and then there's a lot of paperwork involved in it. But if in the end you're going to end up with fewer kinds of disaster situations, it's definitely worth it. I'll tell you about that part later. Okay, and then making sure that all the paperwork is in before you get the final release of all the funds. In other words, the federal government and the state doesn't, just give you this pot of money and then you spend it. It's phased in. So the deed itself, when that property is actually acquired by the local community, there's a clause that's in there that says this property will be kept free of any construction in perpetuity, so that there will not be the same kind of a problem again. There are very few exceptions to that, and they are related to this open space kind of use, recreational kind of thing. So for instance, a public facility, a public restroom, which won't be open on all 4 sides because most of us like a little privacy, but they actually have to be built in a certain way so that they comply, and they're not going to create more of a hazard. And then that it has to be in conformity with this whole idea of being open space. But the specific language is this is the Code of Federal Regulations. You can get that from the internet. It's available for free. Okay, so when we're doing all of this, we need to keep in mind that, okay, so this property owner is now out of harm's way because he or she's not there anymore, but this whole project is going to have an impact on the entire community, not just that individual. And the first part of it is that the community itself is not going to be collecting taxes on that structure anymore. So we start thinking about tax rateables, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of communities have problems with what they say is too much parkland or too much open space. They forget about this thing down here, which is that people like to live near open space, and that it often increases the appraised values of structures. But going back to this idea about tax bases, there's often this opportunity for something that's called in lieu of tax payments, or basically donations by certain groups or organizations instead of being taxed because they're now in tax exempt status. These open spaces, for instance, if the land has now gone to a conservancy for management, it may not be necessarily the community that is managing it. They may decide that, okay, a local conservancy group or friends group is going to manage it. Then, that group may decide, and then they're tax exempt. That group may decide that it wishes to make a donation, some small donation, but it's some donation to go back into the that tax base. The fact that we're now losing certain areas that could be constructed means that the entire plan for the whole community in terms of zoning, subdivision and land use and all those kinds of things needs to be rethought. And that means that it's not just what kinds of land uses, but also the infrastructure serving those various land uses, whether it be roads, whether it be water lines, whether it be sewer lines, because in some instances these buyout areas had water lines and sewer pipes and things like that going through them, and those either need to be redirected or they need to be stubbed off, or they need to be maintained even though it's still a parkland. So lots of things that have to go into that. Planning the whole land use, and now that that particular flood-prone area is not inhabited, will change the evacuation routing and the emergency planning that a community has to undertake as well. Okay. So here's part of the whole process requires a lot of community outreach, a lot of communication with the individuals. And this is really important because people will misunderstand about it. So this is down in the borough of Darby, along the Darby Creek. This is the Darby Creek over here. This is an old aerial photograph from the U.S. Geological Survey. And this street here, there are about 13 or 14 houses along it, and they were flooded more and more frequently because upstream, up in Montgomery County, a lot more development was going on, and more development meant more impervious surface. More impervious surface meant more runoff. More runoff meant that it was just coming straight down, because this is on its way down to, you know, where it's going to meet in with the Cobbs Creek and the Delaware River and the Schuylkill. So these properties were getting flooded over and over and over again, so they were all bought out. This area is now all set as open space.
That's Barford Park, right?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. This area was all set as open space, but then and this happens to be, so this is monitored by the Schuylkill Riverkeeper, and as a volunteer for the Schuylkill Riverkeeper, this is one of the areas that I do the monitoring on to see if, you know, how much new knotweed and all those things. And one of the things that they did was, aside from clearing it and putting trees in there, was to put some baffles, some big boulders in the river, the creek back here, to slow the water down, because this is a straight run, and water runs much faster when it's running straight as opposed to meandering. So I went down every time I go like 2 or 3 times a year, but there's one particular time I went. It was, I guess it was 2 years ago. It was right after we had double whammy there of Irene and Lee, and the mayor had just been there, and she was very upset because she said it didn't work. It's still flooded. Well, of course the water's going to come up. It's just that these houses are no longer in harm's way. I mean, the street is still here. But you know, this is where public education is so important. You have to tell people what it's actually going to accomplish. It's not going to make the water go away. It's just going to mean that you don't have to pay to, you know, get people out of harm's way and to rebuild the infrastructure and keep repairing the roads and all of those kinds of things.
You know, at the bottom of that picture, there's a furniture store that got repetitive loss 12 times.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's,
So that you can never mandate a buyout, though?
you
right?
cannot mandate a buyout. No, you cannot.
So FEMA will pay for it an unlimited number of times? Like
No,
in that
people will
part.
not pay for it an unlimited number of times because of the severe repetitive
Oh, right,
losses.
right, right.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
so
right. That's what
right.
James Lee Witt was trying to put an
That's-
end to.
right.
This endless repetitive loss.
Right.
Who was,
James Lee Witt, he was head of
Right.
FEMA.
Right, yeah. I worked with him, so back in the late 1990s, up to, there was a 5-year time frame where there was this technical mapping advisory council that I was actually a member of, and 10 different groups, and we were all advising FEMA on things like the technical side of it, because FEMA had kind of been living up in its ivory tower, and President Clinton appointed James Lee Witt because when Clinton was governor in Arkansas, James Lee Witt was the emergency manager for the state, and he did a great job. So he is a very proactive guy, and he really did a lot of things to get FEMA moving ahead and instituting some of these things about, we can't pay for this stuff over and over again. And the thing is that FEMA can't say who it will and will not cover. It has to go through Congress, because the program was created by Congress, and it's only the actual management of the program that is done by FEMA. So Congress had to be convinced that, you know, we don't want to keep paying over and over and over again. That's when we got the severe repetitive loss thing. Okay. So again, public education is incredibly important in this, so that we know what it's about. So 2 last slides with some important points if you remember nothing else. This is what you remember. Number 1 is it's not the homeowner that makes the application. It's the local community, and there's this whole process to go through. It's intensive, but in the end, it really makes a huge difference in terms of the stress levels within the community. Again, voluntary only, cannot be through eminent domain or condemnation. That's a very important aspect because a lot of people, as soon as they hear buyout and government in the same sentence, they automatically assume that it's a condemnation. It's not. The fact that the buildings are totally removed down to, even the basements are filled in so that you don't see any building anymore. And then it is owned by the local government, but it can be managed by a local conservancy as well. They must remain an open space, and there is actually a clause in the deed that requires it by law to be maintained in open space forever. And then depending on how if you got funds for that particular storm that is now the reason for you to be getting bought out, some of that may be deducted, but it depends upon what your funding was for and if it was for that particular storm event or something else. Okay. So it's a kind of a case-by-case scenario on that. And then my last slide is some resources for you. So if you want to go through the entire process, the first one talks about how to buy out properties. This is available from FEMA's website. The easiest way to use FEMA's website, which I find very cumbersome, is when you go to this www.fema.gov, there's a little query box up in the upper right-hand corner, and you just put this in, FEMA-317, or you put in the title of this. If you try to go to the library, the FEMA's library and find this, it pulls up all kinds of stuff that where did it get that? So I recommend that you use that one search box, and if you just put, even if you just put acquisition and 317 in there, you'll get the right thing. Then, and that's about 150 pages long or so. And then there's this desk reference for the hazard mitigation planning itself. And this is about 260 pages long, but it's very useful for getting a good overview of what mitigation is, and it also has a big section on property acquisition for buyouts and open space, so it's very useful for that. And then right here in Pennsylvania, if you have questions, whether you are a community official or whether you're a concerned citizen or you want to know more, Tom Hughes is the one who's in charge of that. He's in charge of so he works with the mitigation grant program, he works with the repetitive loss programs, he does it all. Used to be divided up among like 3 or 4 people, but that's it. So we have about 4 minutes left. Are there any questions that I can try to address for you? Yes, sir.
Is it a requirement that you must be in a designated floodplain area to be considered
For buyout? Yes.
In other words, you have to be in 100.
You have to be in the 100-year floodplain. Now, it's one of those things that if you have a severely, repetitively damaged structure, and it happens to be in a less frequent, like a 500-year floodplain, 0.2% chance floodplain, but that is repetitively damaged by flooding, that's going to get higher priority though. So it's it's kind of a balance.
Okay. So it's not an absolute.
Yeah. Right at the top is, in general, to generalize, it should be in the 1% plane. But if you have severely damaged structures that keep on getting damaged over and over again, they may be eligible as well. And that's where I suggest that you talk to Tom Hughes on how to accomplish that. Yes, ma'am.
Are you at all familiar with a process that might be similar for commercial properties or available for commercial?
You can buy out commercial structures
So
as well.
the same sort of process is
Yeah.
applicable?
Yeah.
You said it, but I missed it. What's the date of the most current regulations? Like how updated are the maps?
Oh, the maps they vary from community to community.
Okay.
So you need to check your own community. There's not one size fits all, and they're not updated on any regular basis. It's it's like when you get the resources to update your map.
Okay. You had just mentioned some dates at the beginning. I'm not sure.
Oh,
July of 2012, something.
Oh, that was a law that was passed. That's not about the maps,
Oh,
right?
okay.
Yes.
Suppose your local government doesn't give a damn. Suppose you're just 1 or 2 people that got flooded out, and they don't give you any help. How do you get a FEMA grant?
You can't unless you get it. You might be able to get it through the county if the county's involved in any of those things. But the problem is that you have to have somebody who's willing to take on the management of the property as, you know, as an open space acquisition. I would suggest you talk with, if you end up with, you know, one person over here and one person over there, you know, it's one of those things where the hazard mitigation program is the way to go for that. And I would talk to Tom Hughes on what to do on that. Yes, ma'am.
So there's been a new law enacted that FEMA must look at future risk, including climate change and sea level rise for
Yes.
the future maps.
Right.
I've never gotten a clear understanding. They're working on updating the maps along the Delaware coast and Delaware County.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that before the new regulation was passed, I think they were planning for them to be in effect in something like 2016. Do you know what's happening with those projects that are the flood map revision process that's underway?
Yeah, okay, so a lot of things have been put on hold because of Sandy.
Okay.
Because I'm involved with a lot of the work that's going on. I have clients in New Jersey that are having to deal with these things called advisory flood elevations, because there was actually a whole new study of the Jersey coast going on. Then Sandy hit, and then they said, whoa, we got to stop the study because nobody expected this, and we underestimated what the actual damage was. Right, so there's a process. So the whole thing is, I don't know when, you know, it's one of those things, there's always been a requirement to look at cumulative effects within the watershed, but now they're putting very specific names on it, like, you know, climate change and sea level rise. But that's always been part of it. It's just now, you know, it hasn't been in people's, you know, minds as much. So now if we put names on it, they say, oh yeah, that's part of cumulative effects as well. All right? Cumulative effects, you start building in your watershed, the water's got to go somewhere, you know, water level's going to go
My
up.
understanding was that
It's supposed to
the
incorporate.
old way was
Yes.
completely looking at past events and probabilities. of
Right. It
happening
was looking at
again.
historic and design events.
Yeah.
And what is, and this came out of, this was another study that actually came from the National Academies of Science, which we put out it was a report called Mapping the Zone, Increasing Flood Accuracy, and it talked about putting real events in there to put some reality into the prediction of what both the horizontal and vertical extent of the water is going to be. So there's a long process for studying an area, and then there's a long process for the communities to actually take a look at those maps, review them, and they can either accept them right off, or they may have some appeals or protests. And then there are certain time frames for FEMA to then respond to those
Right.
as well.
Mhm.
So
Okay. So
I don't know when the new maps will be coming out, but then there's a time frame for people to respond to those.
So
Public hearings.
my question is, will the new maps on the Delaware take into consideration future projections like storm surge, which isn't
Storm surge is always, if you have a coastal area, storm surge has always been part of it. They are changing the definition of storm surge. Okay. This gets into a little bit of engineering. There's a whole thing about storm surge along ocean and Great Lakes and estuary fronts. If you have a 3-foot breaking wave, that's an area that's defined as a V zone as opposed to an A-type zone, which is what we're more used to within Pennsylvania. And those areas, now we've got the impact of water as well as just the weight of the water. Now we've got dynamic water as well. So the definition is actually being changed to accommodate the fact that it's not just 3 feet of waves, 1.5 feet of wave action can be pretty devastating as well. So I think that's part of what it is. I don't know for certain because I'm not involved in doing some of those studies.
They explained the wave action being a part of it.
Yeah, wave action is big. Yes, ma'am.
Has there been proactive change in their floodplain regulations to prevent situations like Darby, where it was upstream development that caused, if that's, you know, if that is true and they can show that, like, is it?
Well, this is
Are we
where the whole
changing
thing
our
about
methods?
watershed-wide mapping is important rather than just looking at one community, because when you're looking at jurisdictional boundaries, those are man-made. Watershed encompasses a bigger area. And so that's been in there. But local communities don't like to require developers to actually study that because it costs more, and then, you know, they're being accused of being difficult and lawsuits happen, you know, all the slap suits and things
So
like
it
that.
can still happen.
Yeah. I think that with a lot of community action, that, you know, we all raise our voices and make our communities do what they're supposed to do, more likely for it to happen.
Thank you.
So it is 12:22. You have one question?
One more question. If you have properties prior to becoming involved to NFIP and that have severe repetitive loss, and then the community wants to become part of NFIP,
Yes.
does the past loss come into it? I mean, does that get taken into account?
I can't, well, it doesn't, okay, her question, I don't know if you could all hear her, had to do with communities that are just now joining the National Flood Insurance Program so that their citizens can be eligible to purchase the federal insurance rather than buying higher rates. And she's asking if the fact that you had prior floods, does that have anything to do with it? And the answer is, no, that doesn't keep you from being a member of the program at all. It just means that those properties need to be addressed in the community's hazard mitigation planning. But the community is not denied membership or, you know, participation in the program just because it's flood prone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.